financial statements are historical. Investors are concerned with the future. They're concerned with future cash flows. Accounting records what has happened in the past and what the current rights and obligations of the reporting entity are. So if you take something like climate change, where we know we have a dramatic global transition to net zero by 2050 ahead of us, and one that hasn't happened yet, so we know there's going to be a significant discontinuity, the accounts provide limited information. The second limitation is that accounting is only concerned with the financial effects on the reporting entity itself, of the entity's activities and other activities and events. So if, for example, an entity emits carbon, and that imposes a cost on society, but the entity does not pay that cost, there's an externality, an external cost, then that's not in the accounts. But again, from an investor's point of view, you might want to know about that, because a business with a high carbon footprint is one that needs to undertake a significant transition of its business model.
There's no company that will find that its business model is untouched by the transition to a low carbon economy. And, last year we said, climate risk is investment risk. We think there'll be this fundamental reallocation of capital. And then a few months later, people said, well, what about COVID? Might that actually delay it? But in fact, what we've seen during 2020 is an acceleration of that reallocation of capital. And we've also seen, in parallel to the changes associated with climate risk, some really significant events that the pandemic has shown in terms of companies' social and economic license to operate. So it's not just about climate risk, but it's this incredibly fragile ecosystem that we're living in, and how companies are increasingly expected to be playing a part.
The key thing for me is that we use consistent language and consistent frameworks. Because the one thing you don't want, if you're an entrepreneur and you're starting up, whether you're purpose-driven or profit-driven or both, is to suddenly find halfway through your evolution of your company, you've got to completely relearn the way in which you engage with capital markets. So we have to find a continuum from the large companies through to the smaller ones that is relevant. And I think that's very, very important. And that means thinking through ahead of time the different constituencies and being pragmatic as well as purposeful in what we do.
We were talking about, 20 years ago when the IFRS Foundation was set up. Now, 20 years after that, capital markets, if anything, are even more globalized. As an example, in a completely different area, we found that derivatives markets are so global that we needed international standards for financial market infrastructures and for margin requirements. And last year, or the year before that, we had done some work on market fragmentation, and market participants and authorities realized and recognized the need to avoid harmful fragmentation driven by regulatory measures, as that by itself can give rise to different risks. And therefore, having global principles is helpful in this context.
We have a sort of legacy from the last century of bucketing things as economic or social or political. And if anything we've learned in the last few years is that these are very porous membranes. And what might be economic today can become social tomorrow, and vice versa. And this is particularly true as we address climate transition, a transition to a net zero world, because in any transition, in any industrial revolution, there are winners and losers. And we know that capital markets are completely indifferent to winners and losers. They're not there to police morality. They're not there as a value system. However, if you have short-term winners at the consequence of long-term losers, that is an unbalanced transition that just will not last. It will implode.
Let's not forget that due process is an important element of the staying power, and the acceptability of a particular standard in the markets and around the globe. So urgency, yes, impatience somewhat, but speed not at the cost of due process is the point that I would make here.
We want to see governance, risk management, strategy, targets and metrics that show how companies will be aligned toward that well below 2 degree, ideally 1.5 degree world, a net zero by 2050 world. We recognize that not every company is in exactly the same place. We don't think there should be a one size fits all strategic pathway, but it is very important for companies to demonstrate how they will be fitting into that.
I think it's really important that there is collaboration across the system. So the challenge of sustainability is not a national challenge or an industry challenge or a regional challenge, it's a global challenge. And the natural solution for reporting standards is a global solution. And so the faster that all of the relevant parties, investors and companies in particular as very strong voices, but also regulators, all need to come together on this. And recognizing that there is a very strong platform on which to build.